All right, so we're just going to quickly talk about HLP 7, and then I'm going to close this little discussion up with a video. And I'm curious about what you see within your classroom or your school that works in terms of setting that consistent, organized, respectful learning environment. COVID has really challenged us as a field to think differently about this. I am in a state in which we have actually high rates of bullying. We are all, both of us are in states in which we see high rates of suicide among students, even as young as elementary school and middle school. And so what we're looking for are we establishing learning environments that allow kids to feel safe, ready to learn, and belong as part of that community. Now, why is it important for us to do this? Aside from the things I just talked about, this is a foundational HLP. If you don't really have this consistent, organized, respectful learning environment, what you tend to get is things happening, like I provided instruction, but kids aren't ready to benefit. I delivered my intervention, but I have behavioral issues that are interfering with it. So we kind of see this as like the starting point. And if we think about the first 2 weeks of school, this would be the HLP that we would really be focusing on, that we're developing the classroom routines, the behavioral expectations that allow us to have a great year for the rest of the year. Now, when we're mid-year, it's a little bit tricky, or I know in some cases you went from virtual to face-to-face. We have to almost stop and reestablish those boundaries, those respectful learning environments, as we move back and forth. The other thing is it increases the likelihood that academic and behavioral success are going to occur, and increases our opportunities for engagement or practice opportunities. When we look at intervention success, a lot of it is dependent upon the frequency of learning opportunities that students have. Inappropriate behavior, disrespectfulness, lack of organization reduces our opportunities for practice, thus lowers our ability to have a greater impact on students. Now, this gray box down here, to me, is what is so powerful. It really demonstrates us as a teacher, how impactful we can be on a student's life. And, you know, we often talk about like fluffy stories, like how a teacher made a difference, but somebody has actually quantified that we, just with our positive relationships with students, can make a huge difference in their learning from the academic standpoint, as well as the post-school outcomes. And so this 0.52, we talked about that zone of desired effects. We're now in that blue, right? So creating that mutually respectful relationships, not buddy-buddy type things, but that I respect you as a student, you know, you treat me with respect, and we're sort of engaging in our roles as teacher and student. There are similar effects from student to student relationships, but they're a little bit trickier to quantify, although we do find in schools in which there is poor culture that those students tend to perform at lower rates than those who have a more positive identified culture. So what does it look like? So think about the things that are happening in your school, and you're probably like, heck yeah, I got that and I got that, but maybe I'm not as intentional about some of these. We look at those students who are part of the classroom routines and rules, culture of the school, correct, or even culture of the classroom. So, and it could be, I know, Miranda, you're kind of in a different environment, but whatever that entity is that you're working within. This idea of showing respect for all students, I think this is something we've seen really surface in the last year, and it's understanding respect means that we're valuing individual students' differences, their needs, their ethnicity, culture, context, linguistic diversity. And that's a little bit challenging if we're not really sure or we don't know a lot about our students. That's what leads us back to those assessment HLPs, in which we're looking at multiple data sources to really understand and get to know our students. Not just get to know their academic needs, but get to know them as humans, right? And as little people who are sitting in our classrooms. We know that having very clear and consistent rules is critical for learning. The routines, the procedures, and this has to do with everything: how we go to the bathroom, how we get our materials from the box, how we interact with our peers when we turn to do partner work. That we know what we're supposed to do helps us feel more confident about being able to do that. Something else, and I'm just going to show that second bullet on the right-hand side, is that positive and constructive feedback. There is this idea about age appropriateness, right? The way that I interact with a preschooler is going to be very different than how I might interact with a 12th grader. But either way, we're giving positive and corrective feedback. The continuum of strategies. I mean, there's not one thing that's going to work for all kids, that we have this bag of tricks that allows us, based on a function of the behaviors that we're seeing, be able to adapt our classrooms, the way we interact with students, so that we can quickly respond to the needs of our students. And then finally, the main thing about all this is optimize learning time. Teachers complain that behavior is one of the #1 things that frustrates them about being a teacher. And if behaviors are constantly interfering with my ability to teach, then it means they're constantly interfering with students' ability to learn. And so we want to stop. If we're not seeing what we think is an organized, appropriate environment, then this is where we need to stop and refocus. We've got to have deliberate planning around our classroom directions, our procedures, and expectations. And sometimes, like when we return from break or spring break, we've got to reorient students, right? We get a little bit of implementation drift. We want to make sure that we're explicitly teaching those expectations. We can't assume that kids know how to line up. We can't assume that kids know how to appropriately raise their hand. I adopted both of my kids. They were a little bit older, and one of the things that I assumed is they knew how to use the bathroom appropriately, right? It was 5 years old. But to be honest, no one explicitly taught my oldest, for example, how to use the bathroom. And those are things we kind of take for granted, and that's just kind of an illustration, but it's for everything that happens in a classroom. That we assume a kid knows how to sit appropriately in a desk, knows how to take their things out of their desk, knows how to ask a question or interact with a peer. We've got to think differently about our assumptions, because in many cases, kids don't come with the same background that we assumed they did. And if they've been in virtual learning, I'm sure some of you might have seen this, maybe they've been a little lackadaisical in how they interact or, have themselves in their environment, and they need to be retaught how to sit within a classroom because they haven't done it for a period of time. In addition, we have to continually review and intensify what might have worked at the very beginning changes, right? There's more stress. There's things happening at the school that are changing the students' needs within my classroom. So I use my assessment HLPs to really understand what it is that's working and not working in my class, and then reteach, right? Or adapt or modify what I'm doing so that kids can be more successful. The biggest thing that we see is, and I think it's more apparent in the observations that we've seen over the last year, is this immediate response to poor behavior in terms of punishment. Take something away, remove it, get mad. And I think as kids move from one environment or dealing with increased stressors at home, we're assuming that they know how to do things and they're not doing them. And in many cases, there's kids, well, in some cases, there are kids who do know how to do it, maybe choose not to. But to be honest, in most cases, kids may know how to do it, but they don't have the capacity to do it right now, right? They have too much anxiety, there's too much going on, they're forgetting, they're stressed. And we have to sit back and think about these behavioral issues that we see as learning errors, right? Just like we would see a kid who has a writing error or a reading error, that there is a correction that needs to be made in that behavior. And once we identify those kids who may not be responding to our consistent, well-organized, respectful environment, then we're going to move to these other 3 HLPs that are much more intensive, right? But we need this foundation of this HLP 7 to ensure that all students know what the expectations are. I'm meeting the needs of most of my students in terms of their social behavioral needs, and I can work with just a few around these more intensive needs. All right, so I'm going to just share this particular video, and as you watch it, I want you just to, you know, you can be as judgy as you want to judge, right? What do you see? What do you hear? And what are some of those HLPs that we've talked about today or previously that are showing up in terms of this behavioral, right? Like, how do we set up this classroom? All right, so I have to do this a little bit differently because it starts midway, maybe. Oh, here we go. Oh, can you guys hear that? Hold on, let me try something.
Oh.
Okay, hold on.
We couldn't hear it, Tessie.
All right, try this one.
Engages her inclusive 4th grade class in a discussion and review of class expectations. She has her students model and leads them through examples and non-examples of the expected
I can't see it. Can you all?
So we're going to go over just a few of our classroom expectations this morning so that you can. Yeah, we're seeing just the desktop.
Can only do 2 things at once, I guess. Let me see. See, I needed explicit instruction, right, about how to set this up and multiple feedback opportunities to be successful. All right, so here we go.
Remember them and end your time as a 4th grader really well. One thing I want to practice, because we've been kind of being really noisy when we've been lining up, is lining up at the door. Who can tell us what that sounds like? When we line up at the door, Corinne, what does that sound like? Level 0. What does that mean if you're at a level 0, Corinne? Quiet. Quiet. I shouldn't hear you. I shouldn't hear your feet. I shouldn't hear your voice. What else does it sound like? Say it. Silent. So it's silent, level 0. Anything else? Naomi?
Just arguing about what? Where we're at?
Yeah, we're not arguing. We're being kind. All right. Let's talk about what that looks like when we're lining up at the door. Josh, what should I see?
You should see us not talking and not pushing one up and pushing each other.
So our hands are to ourselves. What else should I see, D'Angelo?
Standing quiet.
Standing quietly. And I'm just going to put standing because sometimes we like to get over there and we like to sit on the table or lean against Moses' desk over there or get up against the mailbox, but we're just standing in our spot. Raheem? Facing forward. Love that one. What am I seeing when I'm looking at our line when we're lined up at the door?
I don't know, standing next to nobody.
Yeah, you're behind the person. We are famous for standing next to people, but we need to be behind someone. All right, I need some volunteers who are going to show us the correct way to line up at the door. So when I tell you to line up, I'm going to have Carter, Naomi, Corinne, Heritage, and Sayera. You 5 are going to line up at the door the right way. So show us what it should look like. Line up at the door.
Component 2.
All right, so what are some of those things that you saw or heard from this particular instructional observation? And feel free, you can just yell out, you can put it in the chat box. some of the things that you saw or heard?
She had the student give the specific details. She was, about what should I see, what should I hear or not hear, and besides her telling the kids, she had them generate the responses, which helps them take ownership for their actions.
Exactly, Kay. So that's that engaging students and setting those rules and those routines. Miranda wrote the explicit instructions. She had some practice, explanation, the independent practice, right, with some feedback. Yeah, and the positive feedback, we're going to learn a little bit about praise, and praise is a big deal in terms of overall success, right? We just can't get mad and say, oh my heck, you guys are lining up like gorillas and we need to do this. And we sometimes think it's funny, but she's trying to make it very explicit so that kids understand that this is an expectation. Matt said, yeah, we have procedures for the routine. It's very clear how to do it, right? We're not just saying line up and assuming kids know how to do it. We're modeling it. We're talking about examples and non-examples. So that very explicit instruction. So you can see that if kids are lining up quickly, it optimizes our learning time, right? If it takes us like 5 minutes to line up every time, and we line up like 7 times a day, that's 35 minutes of lost instructional time. However, if kids have very clear explicit routines for things like lining up or getting materials, it increases the number of instructional minutes that we have in which we can provide our SDI or our other supports for students. Any other observations or thoughts about what you saw in that video? I would say one of the things that I noticed is that coming back to this, right? Like, it's not that she had ever not taught this before. It probably means at the very beginning of the year, she taught this. They've been implementing those routines for some period of time. Her data, right, that coming from her assessment HLPs indicates it's not as efficient and as effective as it would like to be. So we're reviewing and intensifying. And in this case, the intensifying is a reteach, right? That reminding students, bringing them back, and viewing their lack of lining up is not as a punishment that you're going to lose recess, but really as a learning opportunity to help them be better learners, to set this environment up for other academic instruction. All right. So now that we got that one out of the way, it's super important. The other ones just sort of fall into place. Now, HLP 8 is provide positive and constructive feedback to guide students' learning and behavior. And if you remember last time, it's literally the same as HLP 22, which fell under the instructional HLPs. And so people are kind of like, well, wait, why are you putting it in 2 different places? And that's because there were actually 2 different research syntheses that were done in terms of providing explicit instruction or explicit feedback for academic instruction and one for behavioral instruction. And both of them had positive effects, but they wanted to make it very clear that there was evidence for both. And so if you look at this table or this image that we shared earlier, you'll see that the evidence is quite extensive, but this bottom one here, HLP 8 that we're talking about, is really around its effect on behavior. We want to know that what we're doing in terms of explicit feedback and error correction has an evidence base, and it does. You'll notice too that it has been found to be effective across disability categories or different types of needs, just like this feedback for learning that we see here up at the top, right? So it's not one or the other, the 2 kind of go hand in hand. And this comes back to our assumptions that, you know, what we know about learning is in order for student achievement to occur, we have to have good instructional routine for academics, and we have to have really strong classroom management, or that HLP that we just talked about has to be set up in order for this to happen. Now, I mentioned praise is a big deal, and praise is one of those things that we kind of don't pay a lot of attention to. We just hope it happens. But there's a lot of research in terms of praise. And so this HLP, if you want to look at the effect sizes, has a lot to do with the extent to which we provide praise to students, not just error correction, but this ability to help kids feel that they're being successful, right? Even if it's a little bit more successful than yesterday, they still need some work. They need to know that they are doing better. So here's some of the research to think about. Is praise is one of the most effective school-based strategies that we can use to decrease problem behavior. If we embed this HLP in terms of our classroom structure and how we set things up, then we can help kids understand that they're on the right track. Many kids with disabilities know that they're probably a little bit further behind some of their same age peers, and we need to orient them so that they understand what they're doing well at that point in time, not always in comparison to their peers, for example. The other thing that we know around positive classroom environments, particularly for students with disabilities, is that this general ratio of 4:1 from a praise to a reprimand is much more desirable than, let's say, a 1-to-1 correspondence or only providing feedback around what kids are doing wrong. If we really think back at the number of opportunities that we had to provide praise compared to the number of times we provided praise, we probably aren't providing as much praise as we would like to. I think about it as a parent. I get really busy during the day. I do a lot of work. I see my kids in the afternoon and I get their grades. And my first thought is like, oh my heck, you failed that again, or you did this, or you did that, or your room's not clean. And if I really think about it, I probably had 4-to-1 reprimand to praise. And in order for me to really create a respectful environment, a positive learning environment, I've got to flip that around. So the evidence suggests that, thinking about the number of praise opportunities for every 15 minutes. I know when I was a school teacher, one of the things that we did in our schools, we had a little beeper. Some people may not have any idea, but it was this little vibrator that we wore, and it went off every 15 minutes to remind us that we got to say something that's positive and constructive feedback. And that seems really weird that I have to remind myself, but as we get really busy into the day, it's easy to forget about that part of learning. So here's just some strategies I'm going to ask you in a second to share. So if you have some other strategies, start to write those in the chat box. So that, rubber bands, and this kind of depends on the grade span. I know Miranda is saying there, is that, moving rubber bands. I've seen people put tape on their hands and put marks on it, but it's a way to remind us that something needs to happen. Miranda's saying that could be tricky for sure, that it can sometimes look as like you're reprimanding, right? Or seem really unauthentic, right? Like, wow, why is every time she says something nice, she moves a rubber band? It doesn't really seem natural, and kids do pick up on that stuff. The other thing is tallying the number of positive feedback, right? It's not that we're trying to change student behavior, we're trying to change our own. And if we're not explicit around our use of those behaviors, then kids will start to pick up on it. So you can have, I know I've had my kid also say, how many times did I say something positive to you today, and not complain or do this? It really helps us start to realize the extent to which we're using praise versus some other type of feedback. The timer, which I recommended, I know we've also had, I've done observations in classrooms to just give people a sort of unbiased perspective around what's happening. Sometimes we do a lot of praise, but it's really geared to a couple of students. And we need to think not only about the amount of praise, but the spread of the praise that we use within a single classroom. So I'm curious what some of your strategies that you're using, maybe to make sure you're providing sufficient feedback for one, as well as praise. And you can feel free to unmute or put in the chat box. But this is one of those HLPs that seems really simple, but requires really explicit or intentional focus on our part. And if you're not really providing praise, but you want to, what might be something you do? Yeah, Kate, I think that's the case, is that the being genuine. If it seems really forced, and I have worked with some teachers in which it's just hard. They're like, I don't think like that. I'm just trying to get the work done. I'm trying to get to the curriculum. That when the buzzer goes off, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, you're doing a great job over there, little Billy. We want to make sure that it has to be very intentional and authentic. What else? I think about it for kids too. I know here we just had a study that came out that we have one of the schools in the country that has, and it's an elementary school, that has high rates of negative talk among students, a lot of bullying, and teaching kids as well, is that, you know, that creates a negative environment. Usually try to see the most tricky kid when he's doing something awesome. I had a kid, my oldest was really, really hard. He had very severe behavior, and trying to pick out some of those things that are positive. And it's almost like having to orchestrate an opportunity for success so that you could provide that level of praise. Yeah, in preschool, Miranda, it's a great idea. It's a little wink, like I caught you, even a smile, like a smile is so powerful for students that, you know, the kid looks up and you're like, you got it, you know, you don't really have to make it, a verbal praise. It's just something that's, they recognize that there's something positive about that environment. Any other thoughts or things that you've seen folks do that you're like, yeah, I remember being in that classroom and it just feeling really positive, and kids really felt like they, even though it was good constructive feedback in many cases, there was positive praise consistently throughout. All right, well, I'm hoping you've seen them. But this is something, it's a quick win, super easy to do. Heck, you could put a Post-it note in the back of your classroom that if you need a reminder, and all of us do, is just make sure, have you given praise today? And we can set up our environment so that we're increasing our intentional praising of students and positive feedback. All right, so let's get to that HLP9. And that HLP9 is the one that has the large effect sizes and large levels of evidence. You did receive a handout that talks about what this looks like and what are some of the things that we want to consider. But this idea of social behavior, to be honest, in the 80s and 90s was a critical piece of many school curriculum, that we taught kids how to interact. We taught kids how to communicate. We taught them how to learn, how to organize their materials. But I think as the policies have changed, particularly at the federal level, there became almost this over focus on academics with the assumption that kids already had these skills and we did not need to explicitly teach them. And what we're finding now is our lack of explicit teaching of these behaviors leads to larger issues for students. Yeah, Kay's saying don't overlook the kids who are always good. I think that's the other thing, is we sometimes over focus right on the one kid and over praise. I think it's Kay, you said this as well, is that genuine praise, that we have to be looking for the good in our kids, whether it's the way that maybe they're just sitting there and doing a great job, but not really anything magical or amazing. They need that feedback that they're in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. So I want to just share what we know about student behavior, is that We have to teach kids these things like self-awareness, self-management. We often focus on these at the secondary level, but to be honest, they can be taught even at the preschool level. And this responsible decision-making that's age appropriate, relationship skills that are age appropriate. We can't assume that they're getting those at home. We definitely don't want to assume they're getting them from social media. So it's better to get in front of those, plan for that instruction, deliver that instruction, and engage students in the understanding the impact of that instruction. There are things that contribute to student behavior, and some things we can control and some things we don't. And we often look at the things on the left-hand side in that blue as those unalterable variables. And unfortunately, they often consume our conversations around how we address behavior at school. But to be honest, we have a lot more control over the things on the right side. And those are the things like that HLP 7 that we talked about in terms of the environment. Teaching kids this explicit strategies to engage in these can sometimes override the negative effects that might be occurring at home, including trauma or lack of exposure or, you know, issues with feeding or whatnot. We can not necessarily fix those, but we can counteract some of the negative effects in the things that we do. And we know that systematic, explicit instruction in teaching social behavior has a very large positive effect. It seems really silly, it seems really easy to do, but it is so critical, particularly in the first couple of weeks of school and any time that we return from any sort of transition or change in our traditional schedule. Now we're going to watch a really quick video. It's not the best video, but it does sort of illustrate what we know about teaching social behaviors. And we know that in order for us to think about effective academic instruction, we have to teach kids manners and positive interaction, how to be a student in the classroom, and ways to resolve conflicts with students. I'm going to watch this really short video.
Do you think any of us will look back in our lives and regret the
All right. So as you're watching the video, if you see something, you're like, oh, I can see where she provided explicit instruction or use some of the HLPs, feel free to put those in the chat box.
And we are sharing our thinking with our partners. We need to turn and face our partner. We need to remember that one person talks at a time. And we need to remember to look at our partner and listen carefully.
The integration of social skills with making meaning, actually, I think that it's important to say that social development and academic development and making meaning are really integrated. One relies on the other in the program. In other words, if kids are not successful in one of those areas, they're not going to be successful in the other.
Okay, Matt?
I agree with Marco because that is very true, because if she didn't love them, then she would have abandoned them a long time ago.
One of the biggest pieces of making meaning at the very beginning, from the very first lesson, is building a sense of community in the classroom, where the students are able to talk about how do they want their classroom to be, how do they want to be treated, so that when they bring that sense to the strategies, they understand how to work together as a partner.
So which one do you like better? I think that one that you said is the main idea, and this one is the supportive.
In making meaning, we have partners work together for an entire unit, which can be anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. And we do that because we think it's important for kids to get a chance to know each other. And when they work together for a period of time like that, they will encounter difficulties that are natural for people to have when they work together, children or adults. And it gives them the opportunity to work through those problems. And it's through working through problems that we believe children develop socially.
Kind of focus on one, and I need to kind of express what my book is about and express it more than I usually do, because I don't give a lot of information about this. And because we need to work on both of us speaking more and using a little bit more of the prompts, because we only use them once or
The
twice.
social part of making meaning
So I want to stop right there and just ask, well, what are some of those things that you saw in terms of this idea of teaching social behavior? Some of the things that you observed were happening, and what are some of the effects that you saw from that? Don't be quiet. It's our last session. Let's make it go out with a bang. Anybody? Yeah, explicit instruction, use of variables. Yeah, go ahead, Kay.
I was just going to say the picture, I mean, this first person that we watched, I mean, she modeled the same things, you know, that we've been talking about. She went over and, you know, she had her pointer, which is sort of funny there. But I mean, she had it visual. Well, one thing that's important too is she had verbally said it, but it was also visual. So they see it and they hear it. And then she just went over it.
Yeah, and then they practice it, right? I think Chris is that behavioral instruction is, you know, we get frustrated with our kids who aren't listening or don't interact. But if we think about that as a need, then we can step back and say, wow, you know, I see that when you all talk, you don't necessarily use respectful language. Let's talk about what that looks like and what we would, and then practice it and then go through it. Some of the other is, yeah, the conversations with peers. And this actual intervention, this is just a particular one, but technically you can create your own. If you'll notice, the outcome of interest was not that they had just appropriate behavior. The assumption is they needed those appropriate social behaviors in order to engage in appropriate interactions with their peers around the content. And we know that kids who talk about it, right, have more opportunities for practice, get deeper understanding of the content. So it wasn't that the outcome was, I just want my kids to be nicer. The outcome of this was to teach them the behaviors to make learning easier and more effective. Yeah, and Matt said the kids listened, they responded appropriately. And I'm sure you've walked into classrooms and you're like, oh gosh, they have way better kids than we do. You know, and I'm sure all of us has done that. We're like, oh my gosh, I wish I had that class. Well, that class didn't just occur, right? There was instruction that was set up, the environment, the opportunities, the way that we teach led to that outcome of kids, like you just saw, having a conversation with each other. Yeah, lots of practice. And like you were saying, Miranda, you know, they do have lots of independent practice. And to me as a teacher, heck, if they're interacting with each other, it means it's not teacher facilitated learning. It's me as the facilitator, but kids are interacting. And I can then intervene and provide more explicit instruction if needed. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, Chris, that idea that kids getting to high school already have these, it's not the case. I taught higher ed for 10 years. And what we found is that even college students, people coming right out of high school, needed to be explicitly taught what were the expectations and the routines for how we do our work. Remember, we have 3 HLPs around collaboration. That is not a natural skill. That even as adults, we have to be explicitly taught and have practice opportunities with feedback about how to collaborate. I think we've talked about co-teaching on some of these calls. Think about co-teaching is not a natural activity. We have to learn we have to be taught, and we have to learn and practice how to work together to co-teach, right? It just doesn't just happen because we're cool people.
We've noticed too at the school I'm at that with 3 years of intermittent in and out of school, you know, we've pivoted numerous times between virtual hybrid where only 50% of the kids were allowed at school at a time. So we had to room and Zoom. We did that almost all of last year. So you had to teach half at home and half in the room simultaneously. And then, then back that the kids have almost not forgotten, but they've been isolated. It's been so abnormal developmentally that that you have to do more of that than you might have otherwise.
Yeah, and Kay, I'm so glad you said that. And that is a national crisis that we've noticed, is that, kids need to be they need to be taught how to be learners. We assumed when they moved from the in-person learning to remote learning the first time that they would just get on the computer and start learning. But those schools that were more effective actually spent some time to teach kids how to appropriately behave or interact with their peers in a virtual setting. My youngest son is in a virtual classroom, and I know that they did explicit instruction on how to appropriately use the chat box, things you put in, things you don't do on video, it's a whole set of learning behaviors that kids just didn't have and didn't generalize from in-person learning to virtual and then to go back.
Right, we did that too, and we had expectations for, you had to have your camera off. Some kids had to be in their bedroom because of multiple kids in a family, but they had to be at a desk. They couldn't be lounging on their bed, or and I'm in a middle school, and I live in Wyoming, but I'm actually teaching in the Middle East. So it is now 2:40 a.m. here.
That's amazing.
But yeah, it's not just the US, we definitely see it here. And, think about second graders. They haven't had a normal school year in their entire career.
Correct.
In some cases.
Yeah, exactly.
Their career of 3 years.
Yeah. So imagine, right? They're going to come back to schooling might actually look different next year as well, right? So every year, this particular HLP, regardless of their grade span, right? We have to explicitly teach kids what are the behavioral expectations. We know that employers have also identified that those new high school students don't always have the social behaviors to be employed appropriately, right? Social media, they're on their phones. They don't use appropriate language when they interact with folks. They don't look at people. Like these very basic skills that probably start in this preschool setting, right, have to then be consistently retaught, reinforced as kids move through all of their grade span throughout their schooling. So I think this goes back to just to reinforce what Kate said, is that we have to be intentional about this. We've got to design the way that we teach our social behavior. There's general behaviors that we teach all students, but then we'll have those students who will need more explicit instruction, more specially designed instruction around those social behaviors. And we have to think about what is it going to look like. We then have to implement those programs. And one of the things that we struggle with is consistency in being able to follow through. And like Kay, you were mentioning, they would go face-to-face and then virtual and face-to-face, where the expectations are constantly changing. And it's hard for me as a teacher to consistently implement the expectations or the praise or even the consequences of those behaviors. And then we know that even with our best efforts, we're going to consistently have to review and intensify for small groups of students. But if we're using this HLP in a way that it was designed, we're teaching to our group of students, we're reducing the number of students who need more intensive supports with our behavior. Doesn't mean we're going to end it all, but it reduces the number of kids in which we then have to apply our final HLP, which is this FBA for a BIP. Now, the functional behavioral assessment, it's really interesting how it's within IDEA, but what's cool is there is an evidence base for creating functional-based interventions. And that's how we see this use of them so consistently within special education. that if we understand why students are engaging in certain types of behavior, we can then develop an individualized plan, right? Our individualized goal, specially designed instruction that's outlined in a behavioral plan so that we can support that student. Now, this last HLP is a little more complex in that it has two really big buckets within it. The first part is the FBA, which is the comprehensive approach to collecting and analyzing data. We're using some of those assessment HLPs to develop a hypothesis. And really that hypothesis is what drives the rest of the work that we do. Once we have a good hypothesis about the function, then we can move into the next piece. That's this development of the behavioral intervention plan. So if you think about our instructional routine, the hypothesis is that design part right at the beginning. Once we understand the hypothesis, we create our plan and then we implement it. And that's where the behavioral intervention plan is. And then we're constantly reviewing and revising that as needed to support the student. Now, I will say behavior is much more complex than we would like it to be. And as I mentioned, this is a real challenge for educators. A lot of folks find dealing with behaviors to be the least desirable part of their teaching job and often see it as a reason why they might leave teaching. We're not really well trained. I know when I started teaching, I was like overwhelmed, and I actually came with a background as a behaviorist. I worked in clinical psychiatric settings with kids, but trying to apply it in the same context as teaching academics, it was like, oh my heck, this is way too much. So there's been a lot of efforts to sort of simplify this. We think about it from a team approach to supporting kids, but really trying to simplify it in terms of what's the behavior, what can we control, and how can we implement what we've designed to address that, that what we control to really help this kid. So I'm going to just share in the chat box real quick. So I'm going to have to, so sorry about this. I'm going to have to change my, I'm going to put this link in the chat box. So if you're one of those people who are like, oh my heck, I hate behavior, it's like the bane of my existence, there is a great series of free resources that help sort of simplify it in a way. And I pulled some of our resources to share with you today that allow you to feel more confident, not turn you into a behaviorist by any means, but to allow you to implement these social, emotional, behavioral HLPs with a high degree of confidence and consistency. All right, so here we go. So if we think about the behavior, I just want to set it up because we're going to do a couple little activities. So get your chat box ready. But we think about behavior in terms of the ABC, right? A lot of people talk about that antecedent, behavior, and consequence. And the antecedent is really that thing that precedes the behavior. Could be something like take out your homework, the school bell rings, the school bus shows up, right? Anything that occurs that then seems to result in a behavior. And the behavior is anything that's observable, it's measurable, I can see it, and I can record it, right? So it's the student's response to that. And then what we're looking at is what is the consequence. So the bell rings, that's the antecedent. The kid stands up and runs out the door. And then the consequence is he's out of the class as quickly as possible, right? And he doesn't have to talk to anybody. So that's kind of like this antecedent, behavior, and consequence. We also then look at some of the setting events. And some of these things we cannot control, but impacts our ability or impact some of these things. An example is the kid stayed at a parent's house in which he doesn't have a good relationship with. His girlfriend broke up with him well before school, and so he was already frustrated. So when you asked for something, he got mad and threw the pencil, and then he got out of the work, right? So we have to take into account all of these components of behavior, which make it a little bit more complex, but it actually makes it easier for us to respond. So if we think about all our behavior in terms of a function, this final HLP is around our ability to use data to identify the function. Once we know the function, then we can use all those other practices to develop a plan, like a behavior intervention plan, to intervene, to address that function and teach the appropriate behavior, which was our previous HLP. Generally, it comes down to two things: to get something or to obtain something, or really to avoid or escape something. And so if we think about it, we often see this behavior, and in our minds, we might think, oh my gosh, that kid hates me, or he's just trying to get out of his work. But we really have to do a good review of our data, our multiple sources of data, or HLP related to assessment, to identify why the behavior looks the way it looks. And we know that there are different ways, even if the what's happening is different, the consequence is the same, why that is happening might be very different, right? So the kid might be trying to get attention from an adult, but the kid may also be trying to avoid attention from an adult. So it's not as black or white as we would like it to be. So what we do is we try to identify, really what are the function of the behavior to the extent that we can with the information that we have. All right, so we're gonna do a quick little opportunity. So this is Jonas, and in the chat box, you're just gonna write an A or a B on what you think it is. So when Jonas is asked to complete an independent assignment, he disrupts his peers and refuses to begin the assignment. After this behavior, the teacher then sits with him and helps him work through the assignment so he gets it done. And in the future, Jonas keeps doing that. He keeps disrupting his peers and refusing to complete the work, especially when he's told it's working independently. Yeah, so everybody sort of look, it wasn't a lot of data, but we could step back and really think about that antecedent behavior and the consequence. We know that this kid's trying to get some attention. All right, so here's another one. Henry's presented with some difficult schoolwork. He complains, puts his head down, and then the teacher takes the work away because she's just tired of it. And in the future, he just keeps doing it whenever he's presented with difficult work. So what is he trying to do? Yeah, so Matt put it B. Exactly. So while the same sort of disruptive behavior in the previous one was to get it, in this case, the kid is trying to avoid it. Means he puts it down, the teacher takes the work away, he doesn't have to do anything. So this sort of simplistic way of looking at function, it would be great if it was that easy, but it really helps us then figure out what we're going to do next. And that's this part that's really specialized with us as special ed teachers, is understanding what it is that's the function allows us to figure out, can we prevent it? Can we teach the kid a different type of behavior, or can we change our response to figure out what's going to happen for the student, right? So let's do some little practice ones. All right, so during a teacher lecture, Martha continually and repeatedly yells out loudly, and she doesn't raise her hand. This is my kid. I should have just put my kid's name. And each time the teacher gives her a look like, come on, a redirection, but then sometimes calls on her. So what's the function of that behavior? All right, is it to get attention, or is it to get out of something? I probably should have A or B on here. Yeah, so in this case, they're trying to get attention. Our understanding that the kid is trying to get attention then allows us to think across this antecedent behavior and consequence and create a behavior plan. So if I say, well, is there a way that I can prevent this? Well, I could provide, if she wants attention, I could provide attention ahead of the lecture. I can give her frequent eye contact. Maybe I tap her on the shoulder throughout the lesson. So she's getting that desire for attention. So that's one part of my plan. The other thing is I need to teach her, explicitly teach her about raising the hand, right? Reminding her that that's part of it, showing how she does it, do some practice opportunities. And then on the other side with that consequence, part of my plan is, in addition to teaching, is being consistent in my response, where I only call on her when she raises her hand. So understanding that function allows me then to develop whatever I'm going to do in terms of my behavior plan for the student. All right, so let's try some of my guided practice a little bit. So we have Susanna, and when she has a difficult writing assignment, she regularly throws her pencil and rips up her paper, puts her head down, and then her teacher ignores the behavior, and Susanna never completes her assignment. So what's the function of this behavior? Is it attention or is it escape? Yeah, avoiding, exactly. So understanding that Susanna's trying to avoid this work, not get my attention, I'm going to think differently. Well, how do I prevent this? One way I can prevent it is modifying the writing assignment. It seems really hard for her. It's a disincentive for her to work on it. So I can try to reduce the likelihood that that tantrum's going to occur by modifying it. I could also teach her a strategy for asking for help, to raise her hand or wait, so that she can do it on her own. And then I think about, well, what could I do in terms of reinforcing? So this is where I might then give an immediate break. I know it's a huge writing assignment. Right when I give that response, what's going to happen is I'm going to say, oh, gosh, it sounds like this is a little overwhelming. Let's stop, or let me help you, right? So I might model. Case saying the assignment likely needs to be more explicit teaching to begin with. Exactly. So we think about these are the options, and then we understand what's our best approach. All right. So that's kind of where this last HLP comes into play, is that we're understanding the function, which is much more complex, than say, just like, I don't know, like, a reprimand or whatnot, but instead we're thinking about how we systematically provide that function-based response for students. Now I want to stop right here and just, I know we have about 5 minutes and close up, but just sort of give you an opportunity to ask questions or feedback. Remember, these sessions are more about increasing your awareness of the HLPs, giving you a little bit of opportunity to view what they look like in practice. I've shared a couple of resources, and you'll see a couple of resources continually shared, as you're moving through your work. But it really takes some time to step back and intentionally implement each of these to see the effect of them, right? So like that last one, that might be one you might focus on to say, am I really thinking strategically about how to how to prevent it, how to teach it, how to change my response? All right, any questions or comments before I pass it over to close this out? Yes, Miranda, I will put them all together and we'll share them. And maybe Dina, you can help me do that to make sure folks get all of the links, the resources by HLP. And that might actually be a good resource just to put on the website to say, gosh, we want to learn more about providing explicit feedback. There's all sorts of cool stuff that are out there.
Yes, we can definitely do that. Thank you.
So as Dina's formally closing up, I just want to give you an opportunity to share, a takeaway from your learnings about HLP. You only have to do one or the other. Or if there was an HLP that really sort of resonated with you, that you're like, man, I just got to be more intentional about that. Not just today, but over the last 4 sessions. Please share that in the chat box as well. And I want to thank you all for putting up with me. Obviously, I'm very excited about this. I think there this is one of those things that if we can be more intentional, explicit, it increases our confidence as a teacher and allows us to be highly successful, which increases our impact on the students that we work with. All right, as you guys are doing that, I'm going to pass this over to Dina.
Tessie, thank you so much.